Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this, what I'm sure will be a very interesting session on the events that are happening in Belarus. I'm Angela Stent. I'm director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies here at Georgetown University. And I do want to thank the Carnegie Corporation for their generous support of our programming activities, and particularly these so-called journalist boot camps that my colleague Jill Daugherty has organized. So I'm going to hand it over to her in a moment, but I just want to say a few words of introduction for Jill Daugherty. I'm sure she's well known to all of you. She's an adjunct professor here at Georgetown University. She's a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. She was a longtime CNN correspondent in Moscow, State Department correspondent, and other places. And she is well known for her reportage on Russia and its neighbors. And she put together this panel together. So again, welcome all of you. And Jill, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Stent. Thank you very much. And I have to say, Dr. Stent was my advisor when I was writing my thesis at Georgetown, and she remains my greatest, I'd say, advisor on Russia and the former Soviet Union. I have two of her latest books right here, and they are well thumbed because they really get into, I think, some really deep understanding of what Russia and the former Soviet Union are all about. So I'm really glad to welcome everyone to this boot camp, another one in our series. And today's subject is, as you know, Belarus and the still evolving situation there. And I'm really glad that people are here in spite of coronavirus. But I think the interesting thing about doing all of this on Zoom is that we've been able to bring in experts literally from around the world. And this morning we have two who happen to be in Vilnius, Lithuania. The third is here in Washington, D.C., where I am located. So, Belarus. These events really, and they are historic, are playing out on our TV screens, on our computers, right in front of our eyes. This riveting and sometimes horrifying video reports of protests from Minsk and other cities in Belarus daily. In fact, I was noting that on Sunday, there was yet another very, very big protest in Minsk. And the reports, and it's hard, I can't vouch for every single report, but the reports were that there were about 50,000 people on the streets of Minsk. And we still have the violence ongoing from security forces using truncheons and stun guns and water cannon. And now these security forces threatening to use firearms. And just to back up, and I'm sure we're going to get into this, but as everybody knows, the standoff began after the election on August 9th. It was a presidential election. President Alexander Lukashenko claimed that he had won 80% of the vote. The opposition certainly did not agree with that, and people began to come into the streets. So to help us understand this very complex situation, we have three experts. And the reason I wanted to have these particular, in this case, gentlemen, is that they all have different perspectives that are, I think, very valuable. So the first would be Ambassador Kenneth Yalawitz. He is here at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. He's an adjunct lecturer. And also, he is a former United States ambassador to Belarus. And he began that, he was there from 94 until 1997, 94 being the very year that Alexander Lukashenko became president and has been president ever since. And he also was the ambassador to Georgia from 1998 to 2001. The next person that we have is Maximus Milta. He is the head of Communication and Development Unit at the European Humanities University in Vilnius. And I have recently gotten to know Maximus. He has some very interesting perspectives about society and what's motivating people to come out on the streets. And then finally, last but not least, is Konstantin von Eggert. I have known Konstantin for many years from Moscow. He is now also in Vilnius, Lithuania. He's an independent journalist, political analyst, and he is the Baltic States correspondent and also does a weekly column on Russia for Deutsche Welle, which is Germany's international broadcaster. So, rules of the road, we've got an hour and 15 minutes, which is rapidly going away. So we'll try to keep it brief, but we want to get into a lot of questions. So we'll begin with some questions to our panelists. We will talk for about a half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we will open up to questions. And as usual, you'll find the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen for asking questions. So let's begin with Ambassador Yalawitz. You know, this, Mr. Ambassador, is really a standoff between the president and the opposition, happening in a country that I think most people who know the region or think about it really thought that this was never going to change, that Belarus was kind of locked into this Soviet-style government. You had Alexander Lukashenko, whose nickname was the Europe's Last Dictator, in power since 1994, as we mentioned. And so that raises to me the question of how did this happen? Why are we in this position right now with this standoff? Ambassador?
Thank you very, very much, Jill. And thank you and Professor Stent for inviting me. Any Georgetown program, I'm always delighted to participate. Yes, I think I probably could begin by saying I was there at the creation. I arrived in Belarus in the summer of 1994, just a couple of months after Lukashenko had been elected president. And I would begin by saying that the forces of nationalism, which I think were one of the really powerful forces that undid the Soviet Union, beginning with, you know, Nagorno-Karabakh and the Armenia-Azerbaijan struggle, really did not touch Belarus very much at all. It was a rather conservative place, rural for the most part, and with a population that was rather satisfied, you know, with the Soviet Union. Their status of living was probably better than elsewhere in the Soviet Union. And there were very large numbers of Soviet military in Belarus. So it was a rather conservative place with not a strong sense of national identity. Unlike other places, Belarus has always been sort of part of something else, a Polish empire, a Lithuanian empire. So the sense of a national identity was weak, and sort of the national momentum was not terribly strong in Belarus. They had been independent, you know, sort of grudgingly since 1991, 92. And Lukashenko was a rather undistinguished figure. He was the head of a collective farm, and he had been elected to the, you know, to the Belarus Soviet, you know, the parliament, but so undistinguished that I was told after I got to Belarus that when they were looking at sort of promising leaders in the new independent country to come to the United States for training, his name came up and he was not chosen because they didn't think he had, you know, great, you know, leadership possibilities. So much for that. But anyway, he was elected president in 1994 in what was generally regarded as a generally free and fair election. People sometimes overlook that fact. And he won on an anti-corruption program. That was the nature, you know, of his election. So I think it's important to know that the man did have genuine popularity. You know, I'll talk about what he, you know, how he established an authoritarian state, but he had, and I think he probably still has, you know, a good deal of support in rural areas. But the hope was when he took power that he might be one, you know, of a transitional type of leader who would sort of move Belarus in the direction of what we were hoping for: democracy, capital market reforms, etc. But what he did instead was, I was a student at the Russian Institute at Columbia University, and we had all studied, you know, sort of the Soviet model of government. And what he did starting fairly early on, before I arrived, and then certainly afterward, was setting up this system, which we see basically still in place today. And that was basically, putting the judicial system directly under his thumb, controlling the press, leaving perhaps one or two vehicles open, for the opposition, but basically controlling the press, the media, etc. He dissolved what was then the freely elected parliament and brought in one of his own choosing. So he basically had a rubber stamp, in the parliament. He very carefully chose the leadership in the military and the security forces, to make sure that the leadership, was completely loyal to him. And that's a very important thread, that runs through all of this. He also set up what was called the vertical, and I think this in effect was a parallel, Communist Party parallel to the government structure. And these were officials all up and down, through Belarus, at all geographic levels, who were basically watching over the government, keeping an eye on everything. But the main thing was loyal, to him. So I won't go into this now, but I'd love to in the Q&A. I had many run-ins with him about this process of, of eliminating the free press and eliminating free elections. I still have the scars on my back, but it was a very, very difficult, process to observe. And the source of his popularity really was stability, peace, in so many other places. The Diki capitalism was going on in Russia, and he was able to say, see how stable we are. There are no marchers, their pensions being paid. And I think, that was one of the major, ways, that he was able to really solidify his power. The economy was basically unreformed. It was sort of a Soviet type system. And we used to call Belarus, in fact, I remember in my final meeting with him before I left, I asked him, I said, do you want Belarus to be a museum of the former Soviet Union, or do you want it to move forward? And I remember he glared at me and, and did not answer. How was this kept afloat? Well, the Russians basically kept it afloat with economic subsidies. And I think that helped. And there were, Belarus does have industries. They produce tractors and fertilizers. So, I mean, they were able, to keep going. I did also see in this period the beginnings of his use of violence and force. Towards the end of my time, and then right after I left, there were several members of the opposition and even a member of his government who I knew, the security minister, Zakharenko, who was, believe it or not, a reformer type. They simply physically disappeared, never have been seen for 20 years right now. So he already demonstrated, the ability and the willingness, to use power. So the system, is now 26 years old. He, of course, has falsified elections. The Russian economic support, has continued. But that, of course, is now much more questionable. But going to your original point, Jill, the population was basically compliant. He cut the heads off of any opposition leadership. The press was controlled. It was a conservative place, to begin with. And the idea of sort of a popular manifestation of the size that we now see, I think would have shocked me, completely at that point. Basically, when he would apply the knout, to any popular, demonstration, they would arrest a lot of people, they would beat people, and that would be the end of it. I think the Ukraine situation is one of the triggers for the changes, that we're now seeing, because after the Russian, move into Ukraine forcefully and the taking over of Crimea, Lukashenko became much more nationalistic, in his approach, started to speak more in the Belarusian language, which the Russians have always said is really just a a form of Russian. And anyway, the Belarusians are just our little brothers, so it's not really a separate country, just like they say with, with Ukraine. And of course, the relationship with Russia became, much more difficult. There are economic issues that have intruded into it. But I think Ukraine was a real watermark, because Lukashenko, I think, was very much afraid, that Putin might end up doing the same thing in Belarus. The Georgians, the Belarusians, rejected Russian pressure to create an air base in Belarus. And more recently, the Belarusians sort of opened up a dalliance with the United States. Our Secretary of State Pompeo was in Belarus just several months ago. And this reflects another key to Lukashenko's longevity, and that's his ability to swing back and forth. His primary loyalty, his primary feelings, obviously, are very strongly towards Russia. But as I said, he became more nationalistic as a result of Ukraine. So he always has sought to balance, some of the Russian, sort of leaning that Belarus has done. And he's been a master, at releasing political prisoners and sort of owning up to the West a bit when the Russians are pressuring him. And when, the West is hitting him on, human rights violations or other things, of turning back, closer, to the Russians. And for 26 years, he has been, I think, a master at playing this balancing act. But let's fast forward to right now. What has happened? Obviously, one of the key things that undermined him was the election, the falsification. 80% was ridiculous. I remember in Georgia, they did the same thing with Shevardnadze, and I kept asking, why do you have to do this? And they said, it's because it's the old Soviet mentality. You have to win elections by 85%. That obviously was a critical mistake, but another critical mistake was how he handled COVID-19. He really diminished its importance, basically said, go for a sauna and drink vodka and you'll be fine. And that really hurt him. Others on the panel are going to speak more about societal changes, but I did see at the grassroots, not when I was there, but just following Belarus, the green movement, in the sense that people were looking for ways to organize and to improve their way of living without directly confronting him politically. So what do? You join the green movement. You develop community associations, to clean places up and do things. And I think that was going on the ground in Belarus. And I think a lot of us probably just didn't pay enough attention to what was going on the ground. That, plus the fact that in Minsk, there's some extremely bright, able young people, who are in the tech area, the computer area. They basically were railing, at the lack of democracy and the lack of context. So I think that there was a lot, going on the ground, that was much more broad-based than we were aware of. A question I have, though, is sort of how deep this is in the countryside. As I say, I still think that is probably an area that continues to support Lukashenko. But obviously, the popular manifestations that began after the election give great heart to those of us who are very concerned about the rise of authoritarianism around the world. This was something that is really, really incredible. Where things are, and I'm going to, to finish off very, very shortly, is it seems to me rather much of a deadlock right now. The opposition has set the date of October 25th for him to resign, or else there'll be a general strike called. Pressure is mounting on Lukashenko. He's been declared not the president of Belarus by the EU and the United States. There's sanctions. But I think the key factor is whether the military and the security forces, remain loyal to him. I would draw the comparison in certain ways with Venezuela and Iran, where there have been, massive demonstrations, against the governments. But when the security forces stay loyal, it's very, very hard to, oust these people. So far, the demonstrators have been not anti-Russian, but they have been pro-democracy, pro-human rights, etc. And I think the Russians are obviously very concerned about what's going on in Belarus. Belarus and Ukraine are the pathway, between Europe to Russia, and Russia being so security-minded. What goes on in Belarus is of primordial importance. I don't think the Russians want to intervene militarily, but I'm sure they have their red lines, and that is, if these demonstrations, start to morph in the direction of NATO and the EU, that could present them with some very, very, very difficult choices. But right now, it's a test of wills. As Jill mentioned, Lukashenko has threatened the use of force. And certainly from what I've seen of this man, I wouldn't rule it out. He is certainly, capable of it. Whether the security forces would follow those orders is still another question. I think in a week or two, we're probably going to have a much better indication when we see this deadline of October, 25th going by. If he survives, which I think, he's going to be weaker, and it's going to be much more beholden to Russia. And if he survives, I'm sure that will be the end of whatever dalliances he's made with the United States and, and Western countries. And he may, have to give up and give into this Russian military base. But there are going to be prices, that the Russians, will extract from him. I think the Russians will stay with him because I don't think there's a sort of an obvious successor. And as much as they don't like him, don't trust him, as a Russian ambassador said to me in Belarus, many years ago, he's an SOB, but he's ours. Let me leave it there.
Yeah, that was such a wonderful summary. And there were so many things that you got into. I think one of the crucial things, but I want to get to our guests, is precisely that this is not a protest that's saying, we want to go with the West, we want to go with the East. It's very much, we are Belarus, we are Belarusians, and we want our own democracy, which makes it a very, I think, unique place. So I want to turn to Maximus. Maximus, you and I have had some conversations recently about the society, and you said in one of your conversations with me, you said it's really a tectonic shift that's going on, and you ascribe it to the changes in society among Belarusians, and one of those is precisely what Ambassador Yalawitz was talking about, the IT industry and a high level of education. But so what do you think? What are the main societal factors that are driving this?
Indeed, Ambassador Yalawitz has already provided a brilliant outline of what has been happening in Belarus, not only from the historical perspective, but also in the current turmoil and the current state of affairs. And definitely in year 2020, it's hard to define any other triggers rather than the incapacity of Lukashenko regime to fight COVID, which evidently has been the trigger of utmost importance for Belarusians to finally realize that this 26 years long personalistic regime is simply incapable of securing the health and safety of its own people. And this has been one of the factors that Lukashenko has been building up his platform and continued to carry on with, something that often has been described as a so-called social contract. The social contract has been this invisible connection line between the autocratic regime of Lukashenko and the people. And by social contract, it means that the regime guarantees you relatively poor, but at the same time stable life. And this is what basically the reason why people should be in obedience position when it comes to limitations of their freedoms and rights. However, it may seem to external observers, to people who maybe are dealing less with Belarus on a daily basis, that in the course of the last 10 years, since the very last presidential elections, when we recall again the crackdown on the protests, and these were the elections of 2010, of December 19th, 2010, it seemed that Belarus has appeared in a certain limbo, that there were no news from Belarus, that it seemed that people are somehow in a sort of in a silence in regards to the basically readiness to agree on the regime as inevitability, especially when it comes to the occupation of Crimea by Russia. But at the same time, what has been happening with the Belarusian society is of utmost importance. On one end, we have seen the urbanization that has been continuing, and the recent the recent update that is available from the last census of Belarus demonstrates it quite vividly that Belarusians continue to change their geography. They continue to move into the cities, in particular to the Minsk. Although Belarus is not of the largest countries in Europe, but if we compare size-wise, Belarus is of comparable area with Great Britain. So this is a relatively large country in terms of geography. Although in terms of population, it's 9.5 million people who are living in Belarus, and more the share of people living in the cities is increasing, and therefore the initial base of Lukashenko that he has been emerging in 1994, when he has won on democratic elections, and this is not contested, this is a real fact, it's been shrinking. At the same time, what has been happening in those cities where people were moving, it's also of utmost importance. Although on one hand, the regime has been continuing to shrink the space for independent organizations, for NGOs, and especially for independent media, but in the result of Crimea occupation, as rightly mentioned by Ambassador Yalawitz, Lukashenko tried to portray something what can be prescribed to him as a soft version of national policy, although Lukashenko definitely is not someone who is carrying on a nationalist platform, but he tried to play around with the civil society, and he tried to portray himself, if I may say, as an Atatürk of Belarus. He tried to become an Atatürk as a father of the nation, and this is somewhat a nickname that Lukashenko has created for himself, a father, in Belarusian sounding Batska. And this has been something that's been proud of, to call himself as if the father of the nation. But in those cities, the young people who were living, not necessarily young meaning teenagers, but in the broader sense of people in the age group from 18 to 45 or even 50, they were continuing to develop their space for independent organization, for private sector. We see that the share of the private sector in Belarus has been increasing, although it is remarkable how this role of the state remains important in terms of Belarusian economy. And we know well that Lukashenko has carried out zero structural reforms when it comes to privatization, when it comes to deregulation, and therefore Belarus remains a sort of hybrid where on one end you have still this gigantic machinery scale of Belarusian economy, producing potash, producing this caterpillar-style machines, automobiles, but at the same time where you have a thriving and rigorous IT sector. In Minsk alone, there are more than 100,000 people who are directly economically in a position of direct economic benefit from IT industry. So this gives you quite a visible explanation of the scale, how different Belarusian society have become from this predominantly rural, not that well educated society that Lukashenko has supported Lukashenko predominantly during 1994 elections. And here I would like also to specify the role of civic engagement, the role of civic mobilization that has been exploited by Belarusians even before COVID. It's often mentioned that COVID has been the momentum when Belarusians have sort of exercised the ability to self-organize, where they being in a position of inevitability. When the regime basically has ignored the COVID pandemic, they needed to bring it together. But that would be impossible without the number of initiatives, nationwide initiatives that existed in Belarus somewhere starting from the year 2015. Because the repressions of Lukashenko regime, they have not disappeared. It has been on an annual basis that people would be detained, they would be beaten. However, the scale of that repression has been different from what we are seeing right now. I want just to highlight that when we are talking with you today, this is day 73 of peaceful protests carrying on. And there are more than 14,500 people who were detained in the time of this protest. More than 350 criminal cases that were started. After all, there are 92 political prisoners in the country. So obviously everything happening after August the 9th have been something of completely unprecedented, but that scale of brutality and the ability of peaceful demonstrators to carry on, to have this internal stamina, would be impossible without the nationwide, horizontal driven grassroots mobilization. I have spent 52 days in Minsk, starting from August the 1st till September 22nd, witnessing all of the largest and all of the smallest rallies happening both in central squares and streets of Minsk, but also in the smaller neighborhoods. And I want to highlight that when the presidential campaign was happening, we could anticipate, however, we have not anticipated that when we have seen even in the smaller towns, what Ambassador Yalawitz was referring to, these rural/semi-rural areas, I can make an example of the town called Glibokaya, located in the closest neighborhood with Lithuania. In the town of Glibokaya, which is known as the most Belarusian-speaking region of Belarus, you have only 16,000 people living. When Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was carrying out her election rally in the city, 1,000 of people have come to that rally, which brings you almost 7% of the town's population. And this rally was happening on a working day during the lunch break. So when the presidential campaign was happening, this was evident that the tectonic shift has already happened. However, basically the execution, the fulfillment of this mobilization is something what we're witnessing on a daily and weekly basis. The national ultimatum will demonstrate to us how the nationwide mobilization would outreach to these people working in the industries. And we know that Belarus is a heavily industrialized area. However, I fully agree with Ambassador Yalawitz that there are still two social groups that have not joined the nationwide protest movement. And therefore, if we can say that there is simply no base left for Lukashenko, there has been a meme that Lukashenko has this 3% of support only, not the 80% that he has prescribed. So these 3%, they definitely stand for the riot police, all of those siloviki, as they say in Russian, so these power structures, and also the top level nomenclature or bureaucracy that yet has demonstrated its, a sort of assessment of the situation that it's never late to join the protest, but it can be too early to join. So this is the position of anticipation that we see from the top level bureaucracy in Belarus. But I'm quite confident that the aftermath of October 25th, when the national ultimatum would fulfill itself, will give us more room to understand whether the protest would carry on and reach the final goal. But definitely what is happening now in Belarus can be far more compared with Solidarność of Poland, of Sąjūdis of Lithuania. And as we recall historically, those movements, they did not reach success in a term of 1 month or 2 months. It took us years. So it is clear that the time has come for Lukashenko. The status quo cannot be returned, but it would demand still time ahead to reach that. And the tectonic shift in the society will be the catalyst of change.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Maximus. Konstantin, I want to turn to you now. I would like to try to get a view of what's the view from Moscow. And I know that's not always that easy, but you look at that, you know Russia very well. And I know Russians are watching this very closely and they're drawing lessons just as they have from Ukraine, certainly from Belarus. Putin did offer to send military assistance. I do not believe that has happened. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I don't think it's been sent in. However, he has sent journalists in to work in the media in Belarus, Russian journalists, and that's, I think, significant when you get into the propaganda world. But, it feels like from Putin, Konstantin, it feels like a measured response so far, which to me would indicate that there's a lack of kind of, surety about where you go with this. But can you put us into that Russian viewpoint? Tell us how they're looking at this, President Putin.
Angela, Jill, thank you very much for the invitation. Well, I'm going to try to explain to you how I see it, or rather how Putin sees it, but I'm not speaking for him, and then probably argue a bit with what Maxim said. Well, first and foremost of all, this is not an international security, or rather it's primarily not an international security issue for Putin. This is a domestic issue. No one in the Kremlin thinks of Belarus as something that is so external that you can't meddle in it if you want to. Question is whether you want to. And that's very important. Question is very important. A lot has been said about Putin not liking Lukashenko, disliking the fact that he's constantly begging for money and concessions and so on and so forth, not liking him because they're so different as people and their social background and things like that. It all doesn't matter, in fact, because ever since 2014, or definitely 2015, Putin has made himself into a global authority on countering regime change. He launched it to some extent, trying to save Viktor Yanukovych in 2014, and then, of course, launching his operation in Syria in 2015, which was, of course, very much about countering what he sees as the West in general and the US in particular attempt to change the regimes the US doesn't like. Since then, he continued, and I think that in this respect, everything that we've seen in Montenegro, in Venezuela, to some extent in Libya, it's either an attempt to impose a Moscow-friendly regime or to dislodge regimes that he doesn't like, or to shore up dictators. Shoring up dictators for Putin is not a hobby. It's a way of keeping America at bay, because Russian foreign policy and security policy is all about the United States. There's pretty much nothing else, and China is not present to such an extent. So look at Lukashenko. Lukashenko's been Russian ally since the days of President Yeltsin, 1996, the closest country to Russia, the most dependent country to Russia. And here's one important thing: whoever is the next president of Belarus, he will have to pick up the phone and talk to Putin because of economic dependence. So Putin's been contending with Lukashenko because there was no other choice. And because eventually he came to see that dictators can leave only according to their own schedule when they want to, and not when they kind of pushed out by the popular will, people's power. And in this respect, whether Putin likes Lukashenko or not, he can't afford for Lukashenko to go now, because that will be a huge blow to Putin's prestige. He's trying to save, Maduro or Bashar al-Assad fairly successfully, but he can't save someone who is basically his closest ally. Let me remind you that officially Belarus and Russia are joined in a kind of semi-confederal union state, which is quite wobbly and quite a concoction, but still is official. So I think that for Putin, the game now is to stay on for as long as he can with Lukashenko. It doesn't mean that he is betting on him forever. Of course, Moscow reads the signs. It understands that it will be quite difficult for Lukashenko to stay on indefinitely. However, don't overestimate the way these people in the Kremlin look at things. I think that they put a lot of trust in the power of the gun, and not a lot of trust in the power of the ballot box, idealism, people's movements, and all this kind of Western democratic rubbish. So I think that to some extent, Putin is now watching. He doesn't want to be seen very much as someone who's propping up Lukashenko. First of all, because that will to some extent indebt him to Lukashenko, because Lukashenko will say, "Oh, I'm so important, so Putin is rooting for me." But whether he's helping, of course he does. We don't. By the way, the promise of support was a promise not of the army, but of the police forces, the kind of the siloviki of different type. And here we don't know. I'm sure that if Lukashenko needs an advice on how to torture prisoners, on how to better use rubber bullets or something like that, I'm sure there'll be a lot of professionals rendering their advice to Minsk discreetly and without a lot of publicity. And if Lukashenko needed it, he got it. That I'm sure. What is next? I think that this is a crucial thing. I agree with Maxim on a very important point. The Belarusian revolution is the end of the post-Soviet space as we knew it, topped up as a whipped cream on Viennese coffee with the Turkish intervention in the Caucasus and basically an Armenian-Azeri war which goes on without any meaningful participation of Mr. Putin and Mr. Lavrov. They're promising us there's going to be some talks, but in fact, by now everyone understood that they're pretty much impotent or not as potent as they used to be. So this is the end of the post-Soviet space as we know it. From there, everyone, I mean, historically speaking, we're not talking about tomorrow, Monday, or 2 months from now, but I think that everyone goes their own way. And whether Putin likes it or not, it will happen, including Belarus. But it will be a difficult road. First of all, because of the economic dependence, which still exists, and no amount of high-tech development can substitute the fact that, first and foremost of all, Belarus is dependent on Russian transit hugely and on Russian contraband. We all know about the famous Belarusian salmon and famous Belarusian shrimps that are served in Moscow restaurants. Energy-wise, it's also a huge dependence. The nuclear power plant in Ostrava is built by Rosatom, which is a Russian company. And I think that this is a huge challenge, number one. Number two, where I wanted slightly to argue with Maxim, and I've traveled to Belarus. I think that it is not a very correct comparison with when you compare Belarus to Poland or Lithuania. Just like Russia or the late Soviet Union can't be compared to Poland or the Czech Republic or any other post-communist place. For one simple reason. Hold on a sec, I'm just going to tell my cat to keep the huge difference, is the fact that Lithuania and Poland were occupied. Fighting against foreign occupation for national liberation, I don't want to sound cynical, but in some ways that's extremely easy. To create a political nation out of what we see in Belarus today, and by the way, I'm not implying, and I'm going to come to that, I'm not implying that Belarusians had no statehood to speak of, is much more difficult. And this exactly what Ambassador Yalawitz said, the fact that no one in Belarus really wanted, I mean, no major force apart from very small Popular Front in the early 90s, wanted independence or something like that, is an important thing. It was a thoroughly Sovietized, extremely battered by war republic of the former Soviet Union. So finding what you actually want is not easy. There is a key here. And this key was to some extent, correct me if I'm wrong, Maxim, provided by Lukashenko himself when round about the end of the 90s, he started, or early 2000s, he started to move away from this Soviet narrative on Pesni, Pляски and Slavic brotherhood and stuff like that, and more towards this other alternative narrative. Basically, we are the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Basically, we are the intersection of East and West. Basically, we are the Polish Szlachta. We are the first religious tolerance law in Europe. Of course, the Poles and the Lithuanians would slightly disagree with that, but that's another matter. This narrative exists in Belarus. And it's a nice narrative to move on to Europe. But there is one snag here. You can't create Belarusian democracy having Putin inside. Putin is the biggest challenge to Belarusian democracy and to Belarus turning itself into a normal Central European nation, which probably a lot of people hitting the streets in Minsk would like it to be. I mean, look, I traveled to Minsk quite frequently before COVID. There are 5 electrichkas, 5 electric trains going between Vilnius and Minsk every day. I mean, they are full of Belarusians who fall in love, do business, go on holiday. They know what Lithuania and Poland is. But frankly speaking, and that's the last thing I'm going to say, it's not so much the unfinished business of nation building that's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult, there's no doubt about that. But it's this desire to ignore Putin and to say, by the way, we're going to create democracy, but on the other hand, we're not going to irritate Moscow too much with, talk about Western integration, EU Eastern Partnership, and God forbid, this horrible thing, NATO. Eventually, you'll have to choose. I mean, not you, but you Belarusians will have to choose which way to go. And that means that eventually there's going to be the next confrontation, which will not be with Belarus, but will be with Putin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kostya. I want to open it to questions, but I really want to give Dr. Stent a chance to jump in here if you have a question to kind of kick us off. And I'm watching the time. We have like half an hour, but please, Dr. Stent, if you have a question, I'm sure you do.
This was a fantastic discussion. Thank all of you. I think maybe to ask our guests, is there anything that either the European Union or the United States can do to influence the situation and to, try and prevent a more bloody crackdown?
Ambassador Yalawitz, do you want to begin?
Yeah, Angela, that's a terrific question, which I've agonized over ever since 1994, being in Belarus. I think the conclusion I've come to is that from the outside, there's not a great deal, that can really be done. We've had sanctions on Belarus for quite a long time. They haven't really changed, much at all. And in the current situation, I think, again, when you look at the correlation of forces, which I'm sure Mr. Putin has done, we're not going to intervene militarily, as we have not intervened militarily in Ukraine. And I think, as Konstantin was saying, this is Putin's, backyard. This is an internal issue. And I don't think we can bring the pressure to bear that could really change things there. We have been noticeably absent now, at least on Nagorno-Karabakh. We're bringing together the 2 foreign ministers. But on Belarus, we made this sort of half-hearted effort 6 months ago, to come to Minsk and meet with Lukashenko and to supply a little bit of oil, to Lukashenko in the hopes of, moving him a little bit. But obviously that has all been shattered. And I just don't think that sanctions and, political pressures are really, going to change anything in Belarus. It's a shame, because I think what Lukashenko and Putin are counting on is the reports a month ago were 100,000 people demonstrating. Now it's down to 50,000. Whether or not that indicates, declining, willingness to participate, I don't know. And maybe, Max will talk about that. But I think, what Lukashenko is counting on is the cold weather and people getting tired of, of demonstrating. And if there's a general strike, I have no doubt in my mind, that he will use force, to deal with that. So I wish I had a more optimistic viewpoint about what the outside world can do, but I'm afraid it's very, very limited.
Well,
I want to go. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Max, if you can keep it brief. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to do brief. I can say that there are 2 tracks. There is a short-term and long-term track. If we address the long-term track, so let's be frank and honest. Did we, the West, do enough to support Belarus in terms of the institutions who are dealing with Belarus? Because look, I am representing here the Belarusian University in exile, who were forced out of the country, were working in exile for 15 years, and probably will remain the single largest institution that is related to Belarus. There are simply no left institutions who have been working consistently. We see our alumni who have returned to Belarus, who are working in NGOs, and we see them now detained. But at the same time, if we talk about other institutions, basically the occupation of Crimea has overwhelmed and basically overshadowed any interest from the Western community to Belarus, which is a very important factor and is also quite shameful, to be honest. Now, in the short-term perspective, what I can say, it is primarily not the institutions who make one or another declaration regarding Belarus. Sanctions in this regard, I believe, are only efficient if they consider every individual who have been responsible for fraud and falsification of elections. We talk about 6,000 polling stations in Belarus, and we know that these were only around 100 of them who actually did calculate votes fair and in transparent manner. There is this online platform Golos that has more than 1,100,000 users from Belarus who are verified users who have submitted their ballots to this platform, and they have indicated what the real outcome of the voting has been on August the 9th. But all the rest polling stations, they have basically done the fraud. Why aren't they on the sanctions list? This remains a mystery for me. But at the same time, what Belarusians have demonstrated themselves, that they need no external input to be able to self-organize. There are these two largest fundraising campaigns. They have managed to collect together up to 6 million euros together to provide support and assistance to Belarusians. These are the platforms Buy Soul and Buy Help. And this to me is the best example that every individual can contribute to helping Belarus. And I believe in this respect, people-to-people contacts are essential. Helping to journalists, helping to people who were beaten, detained, injured, suffering. After all, helping people who are dismissed of their jobs because of political standing. Even sportsmen now in Belarus are left without their jobs because of their political statement, who were the backbone of the regime. On Monday, there is a pensioner strikes happening for 3 weeks in a row in Belarus. Will pensioners be left without pensions? This can also be quite a possible scenario, because for Lukashenko, basically, there are no morals left. He is in despair. He's acting in this frustration mode, and therefore we cannot expect him other steps to be driven by common sense.
Okay, Kostya, if you have something, could you keep it very, very brief, because we do have.
Oh, yes. I think that I totally agree with Ken on the strategy. The strategies for the protests to peter out. They may not completely peter out. But then there's an example of, let's say, Venezuela, where there's been a standoff between Maduro and the pro-democracy middle classes of the big cities going on for quite a long time, and that can continue. I mean, society and an authoritarian regime can coincide and cohabit for some time together. So I think that in this respect, yes, a long-term perspective is more interesting. The short term, I think it will be exactly that. Protests and Lukashenko side by side. Last thing, sanctions. I don't think that much can be changed. I mean, if you could sanction all the whatever 12,000, 15,000 people that were responsible for every single electoral fraud in every single village, that would have been marvelous. I'm not sure the West is prepared for that. Look at the dithering they had with Borrell in the EU about sanctioning, not sanctioning Lukashenko. Well, they say that he's now finally kind of inclined to be tougher on Lukashenko because he thinks he understands Belarus, because he thinks he understands Venezuela. Well, in fact, I don't think he understands both, but it doesn't matter. I don't think that the US has done anything significant. So, in a sense, don't think that Lukashenko can expect something huge coming from the outside.
Okay. There's a question that came up about women, and this is actually a question that I wanted to raise. So let's get into it, because I think it's really important. There is a focus on women's participation. In fact, all of the 3 opposition candidates or leaders are women. Now, of course, it didn't directly come about. One was the wife of a blogger who then he was arrested and she stepped into the breach. And, but we do have Maria Kolesnikova, who's now in jail, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya in exile in Lithuania. That's why we have so many people from Lithuania, because that's like the second Belarus at this point. And then Veronika Tsipkala, who also had to leave Belarus. So can anybody explain why all of a sudden we have these women? It's very, noticeable. And is it actually a long-term thing, or is it just that these women happen to pop up at the right time, but it has, little significance for the future in terms of women's participation? Ken?
Very, very good question. I would hearken back to my experience in Belarus. I traveled around a good deal, and I always like to go to, local locales. And without doubt, almost everywhere I went, the women that I met with were far more impressive than the men. The women who were organizers. They organized schools. They organized medical issues. The guys were out there, basically smoking their cigarettes. And I came away with a very strong impression, that women in Belarus were drastically valued, underestimated. So I'm not surprised whatsoever, to see women come to the forefront. The second thing, again, is, look at Lukashenko, the typical old, male chauvinist pig, although nobody, uses that expression anymore. He thought by jailing, the husbands of these women and leaving one, free, that there was no way that a woman, could lead a national movement against him. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Again, because there's some very, very smart, able people in Belarus. And just because they're female, don't underestimate them. And I think that's been a serious mistake that he made.
I can only add.
Maxime, could we do this? Because there really are some questions. And I think what I'll try to do is mix it up and come back. You can jump in if you want, but let me just bring up another question if I could. Sorry about that. It's about the economy. And this question is the economy the regime's ultimate Achilles heel? It's hard to see how even Russia's financial support could make up for a catastrophic decline in Belarusian reserves and economic activity. Will this affect the economic well-being and ultimately the loyalty of security forces and the nomenclatura, as well as the rural and even state sector who depend upon the state for their existence? So the economy. Maxime, maybe since you started on one thing, would you like to?
I can tell about the economy quite frankly and open. Look, the economy in Belarus is completely unsustainable. As rightly mentioned by Konstantin, it's directly dependent on external financial support from Russia in the form of fuel supply, in the form of loans, in the form of refunding of loans. It's quite remarkable that only in the course of August alone, the Belarusian gold reserves have shrunken by 15%. The 15% of golden reserve stands for $1.3 billion. And this is almost equal to the amount of the loan that Vladimir Putin has promised to Lukashenko. He has promised 1.5 billion. The reason for that gold reserve to evaporate was quite simple. In order to save the Belarusian national currency, the ruble, that has been still in a free flow. So this gives you quite a frank illustration of the people basically withdrawing their deposits from banks because they no more trust the regime. And clearly this will be the kiss of death for the regime in the long term, because it has no sustainable source of the hard currency, as they call it, of US dollars and euros. Lastly, the major exporters of Belarus, like the Belarus Kali, the number 5 potash exporter in the world, it is also the place where the strikes are the most visible and most tangible. And therefore, longer the strikes, political strikes even, or Italian-style strikes continue, evidently the regime has less supply of the hard currency. But referring to women, without women, I can guarantee you there would be no protest at all, because the women movement has given the second breath to the protest movement.
Okay, there's a question here that I think is good for Konstantin, and it's the media landscape in Belarus, how it influences change there. Are media outlets captured, as is typical in other former Soviet spaces? If so, what can be done to shore up or empower the IT-based alternatives to inform and mobilize the public? It's an interesting question.
Thank you very much, Jill. And if I may, I will probably answer, so you wouldn't have to name it again, spell it again. The question from Matthew Wisniewski regarding Minsk and Khabarovsk, because I think that is definitely a kind of Russian topic. On media, actually, although, of course, lots of things have to be done to shore up independent journalism, but frankly, my understanding is that the critically thinking part of Belarusian society, and I think in this respect, probably Maxim is a better judge, is completely unplugged, if I may, from Lukashenko TV. That's very clear. Today, they tried to close down a Nechta Telegram channel. They just rebranded themselves and are going to continue broadcasting on Telegram. I think that what we've seen in Belarus is that social media, and especially Telegram, are playing a huge role in informing and mobilizing people. That's not new. I mean, that goes back all the way to the Maidan and so on and so forth, but this is really, really interesting. And I think to some extent, the way foreign broadcasters, like of course Belsat, based in Poland, as well as my own Deutsche Welle and Svoboda and some others, worked in Belarus, they, I think, managed to find the right tone and to inform people, really. So I think that in a sense, you have to continue. What you need to ensure is access to the internet. I don't know, probably supporting people using VPN more or something like that. But I do think that, on the other hand, and probably Maxim knows it better, this part of society that still relies on TV must be, I mean, in such circumstances, it usually becomes smaller. Just because if you're a babushka who's watching it, you have a grandson who comes in and says, by the way, look at this. Look on my screen, not on your screen. So I think that will eventually, I mean, it evolves in Russia, which actually brings me to Russia. I think that the Khabarovsk protests are extremely significant, not in themselves, but the fact that in a provincial Russian city, you have people standing up, not against corrupt developers or some kind of, local garbage dump or something like that. They're standing up for the guy they elected. And they want him back, no matter what. That's an extremely important principled political position in a place which is, well, I mean, it's a big place. I've been there, but I mean, I have never thought of it as a kind of pioneering democracy platform in Russia. And the fact that they're linking to the Belarusians is also important. And as you correctly surmised, Matthew, and I think I spoke about it briefly at the beginning, this is exactly what Putin fears. He doesn't fear the hipsters in Moscow cafes saying Putin is dictator. Okay, we take our latte and we fly to Paris. But what they fear is actually people in Khabarovsk, like Lukashenko fears people in Vitebsk or in Hrodna. So I think that this is important. And this is the last thing I'm going to say. The hope for the Belarusians is that the Russian regime has now entered a period of physical decline of its leaders. They are very healthy people, but they can't invent anything new. They are not offering anything new. They are offering old stuff, which just becomes boring, like a lot of things that Lukashenko was doing. He wasn't doing anything particularly wrong from his point of view. So saving Lukashenko is a must for Putin. But it is an increasingly more difficult must, including because there is a certain, kind of feeling of comity with the Belarusians. And how much it will cost, I don't know. I don't think it's too expensive to shore up Lukashenko. They're shoring up the Crimea, so it's fine. But I think that what is ultimately the problem for Putin is exactly the fact that every single new election in Russia, the Duma elections in 2021, the presidential ones in 2024, will always be a case for a crisis. And if Alexei Navalny returns to Russia, which I think he will, it will be even more of a crisis. So I think that, yes, Putin is worried by an example.
Speaking of examples, there's another question that comes from a very different viewpoint, and that's talking about Ukraine. And this question says that Maidan, the uprising in Ukraine, Kiev, is now seen by most of the Ukrainian population in the east and south as a complete disaster. Now, I know some of you would not agree with that, but let's listen to the question. To what extent will this dissuade Belarusians from the path toward a forcible overthrow of the regime? So I think, the way I would put that would be, and maybe Ken, you could get into this. What lessons do you think are other parts, especially Ukraine, drawing from what lessons are the Belarusians drawing from what happened in Ukraine?
Let me, though, reverse it for just a quick second, because I heard a program just a couple of days ago with Ukrainian officials. They are very concerned about what's going on, in Belarus. Even if the Russian, military does not intervene, they're very concerned about, the influx of the journalists, that you mentioned. And also, I think without any doubt, there's probably been a major influx of Russian security types and police types, and that on their border, is of concern. I think, though, with Maidan was clearly directed, to get Ukraine into the European Union, to NATO, to break away from, Yanukovych and where they were heading. And that's not what the, not what the demonstrators, in Belarus, are after right now. So, it may be, and I don't know this for a fact, and maybe Maxime can talk about this, but I think, the demonstrators in Belarus have been extremely clever and very sharp, in focusing on democracy, human rights, these stealing of elections, and not, reorienting, Belarus. I think this has given them, a great deal of stature and made it really a tremendous model as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. Maxime?
I can only second what Ambassador Yalawitz is saying, because indeed you cannot see European Union flags in the streets of Minsk. At the same time, you cannot see Russian flags. And this is different from what we have witnessed in Maidan. The geopolitical factor is not the driver of force. The driver is the inevitability of people's decisiveness in getting rid of this personalistic regime, the demand for free and transparent elections, and willingness to release the political prisoners. These are the drivers, not the geopolitical issue, because Belarusians fully understand that it's not only 80% of the debt of Belarus that belongs to Russia, but there is no way possible to basically get rid of the ties with Russia. And in fact, many Belarusians are pro-Russians in the broad sense of these things. The horizontal ties between families, people-to-people contacts, they are important factors. So if you ask a Belarusian what he or she wants Belarus to see in the future, they would respond to you, I would like to see Belarus as Switzerland, being with everyone and with no one at the same time.
Yeah, well put.
Okay, well, I'm looking at the clock again. We have 5 minutes, and I want to kind of ask this last question of all of you, because it keeps coming up in a lot of these discussions. We've now got 3, let's say, political or kinetic conflicts in the former Soviet Union taking place. We have Belarus, we have Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, and then we have Nagorno-Karabakh in the Caucasus. So is it possible to, are these conflicts similar, or are they very different? And is there any general lesson that we can draw from what's happening in the former Soviet space from all 3 of those? And let me start, and if we can keep it brief, because we do have to end at 1:15. But Konstantin, let's start with you, then go to Maximus, and then finally I want to have time for Kenneth.
Well, these things are different in many ways because, well, if you look at Karabakh, there's definitely an enmity that stretches back quite a long time, and there's an interethnic conflict. In other places, it's like Russia. In what you have in Russia is society gradually moving towards this complete boredom and weariness of Putin, and he'll have to invent something to stop it. But I think generally what is important, and I think I briefly spoke about it, is that all the certainties of the last 30 years are gradually disappearing into thin air. Russia is no longer the top security player in the post-Soviet space. I mean, it is a player, but you look, Turkey and China are stepping in. Democracy is not a universal desire of everyone, but people are getting bored with authoritarianism. Authoritarian regimes have come to the end, not because authoritarianism as such is rejected. Some do like it, but because they're unable to give what a normal authoritarian regime should do if it wants to stay in place, and growing, expanding standard of living, and a modicum of civility. So I think all these things, together with the aging of leaders in some of the places, and some quite extreme aging sometimes, I think means that what we see a gradual decomposition of what we used to call the post-Soviet space. And this decomposition will continue. It will be from time to time boosted by events, but the main thing is that it's irreversible.
Okay, and Maximus?
I can fully second what Konstantin is saying, and I want just to highlight that the civic engagement, access to technology, access to internet is the real threat to any authoritarian regime across the globe, and this has been just evidenced in the case of Belarus. For 26 years, it seemed that nothing would change, and it seems that if suddenly this has changed, but in reality, this has not come out of the blue. And the answer for that is the experience of civic engagement, the experience of internet access, and the experience of technology widespreading, which is impossible to crack down on by just simply switching off internet, which Lukashenko tried to do. But again, this did not really help him to ensure the so-called stability. So therefore, if we are eager to support the democratic movement across the globe, we should support the civic engagement, the spread of technology, and the access to internet.
Okay, which leads us to Ambassador Yalawitz with his great depth of experience. So if you can sum it up for the history books, Ken.
I both, Max and Konstantin, I completely agree with everything both of them have said, but I wanted to add another dimension, and that is sort of the broader international situation. We're going to have an election here, in 2 weeks from today. And, the polls are now showing, I mean, it's certainly not a certain, but it looks, now like Mr. Biden is probably going to win. And if he wins, I think it will mean not a return to, the policies of the 90s and the 2000s, but there's certainly going to be more emphasis given to democracy, human rights, and more of what we used to call, sort of the liberal international order. And instead of looking at sort of the Chinese and the Russian models as sort of being in the ascendancy, it may be a different situation. And I think what we're seeing, as Konstantin really put it well about the post-Soviet era, there's nothing magical, about the Russian system. Obviously, it hasn't solved a lot of problems, and, seeing all these manifestations means that, as a model, it's imperfect at best. The Chinese, may be a different matter. But as I say, I sort of view all this in the context of, are we heading towards more authoritarianism, or has that peaked, and are we moving away from it a bit? And it's the latter, that I hope, we're headed towards.
All right. Well, we went over by about a minute, but I think we will be forgiven. And I want to thank very much, really, I thought it was a fantastic discussion. Ambassador Kenneth Yalawitz, Maximus Milta, and Konstantin von Eggert. And I want to invite you back for the next journalist boot camp. Some great discussions. Thank you very much, Dr. Stent, for being there. And I guess we will see you at the next one.
Great. Thank you.
Let me just, it
Okay.
was a terrific session.